Hello, my name is Chuck Wolf. Over the years, I've worked in many different roles, including leading my own leadership consulting company since 1994. I've worked for and with some of the best companies and universities in the world, and have had the opportunity to work with government officials, military organizations, and public and private schools. I'm a leading expert and pioneer in emotional intelligence. Since 2009, I have been a volunteer hosting a radio show I created called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. I really enjoy making a difference in people's lives. The show is on award-winning community radio station, WPKN in Bridgeport, Connecticut. In recent years, Simsbury Community Television has been sharing my shows on their station and on YouTube. My sincere hope is that everyone who watches regularly will learn how to use the Emotion Roadmap in their own lives by listening to people who call in to get help with challenges at work, home, and in communities. To learn more, go to www.emotionroadmap.com. If you have a comment or question, email me at cjwolf@cjwolf.com. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Hi, I'm Chuck Wolf, and you're listening to the Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. This show airs on WPKN 89.5 FM, listener-supported radio. It's a community radio station in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I have the pleasure this morning of having a guest on that's going to teach you about dealing with grief. The show is called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel. Lots of times I get callers and I have people who call in with all kinds of emotionally challenging situations, and I use my Emotion Roadmap to help them to map out a strategy to change how they're feeling and perhaps influence the feelings of others, if that's what's important in making things better for them. Often I'm able to create positive, meaningful differences for people, and at times I find that there's really some thought leaders out there that are doing some really incredible work, in my mind at least, that I think my listeners all over the world really will benefit from knowing more about. How do you deal with grief? How do you deal with grief? I mean, it's something we all experience, and we all have history with it, and we've all had some successful, hopefully, ways to accommodate grief when it shows up in our lives. But also we often think about grief as associated with somebody has died. But I'm going to introduce you to Karen Kramer. And Karen and I got introduced when she came to get certified in learning about the Mayer-Salvay-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test. I stayed connected via LinkedIn. And then I recently saw that she had written this book called Healthy Grief. And I thought, is there such a thing as healthy grief? What does that even mean? I mean, how do you engage in being healthy in responding to grief? It often feels unhealthy at times because you feel so sad, so depressed, so lonely, so upset, so angry often about what happened when somebody experiences a loss that's meaningful to them. And it can be a loss of many different things. Loss of a friendship, loss of a partner, loss of a job, loss of a home. And Karen's created some tools and some concepts I think that you'll find fascinating to hear about, to help you to think through how do you deal in a healthy way with a situation where what was isn't anymore, which is a really unique way to think about grief that Karen conceived of. What was isn't anymore. I mean, you can think about that for a moment. I'd like to read you a little bit about Karen. Dr. Karen Kramer, a.k.a. Dr. Karen, is a guiding light who has transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of individuals around the globe since the early 1990s. With a profound understanding of the human mind, and as a grief recovery expert, Dr. Karen's true passion as a mindset coach, speaker, and author lies in helping navigate heart-wrenching experiences such as divorce, loss of loved ones, and traumatic events. Through her meticulously tailored techniques, she skillfully liberates her clients from the chains of limiting beliefs and negative emotions, restoring their ability to seize control of their lives in 90 days or less. Armed with an impressive academic background, Dr. Karen holds a bachelor's in business, a master's in leadership, another master's in organization development, and a PhD in human and organizational development. Her innovative dissertation sheds light on the intricate interplay between emotional intelligence and leadership. I've known Karen for a period of time, and I'm really impressed with what she's done with this book, and I think you're all going to find this interesting. And I think the book itself is a really good idea to buy if you think you want to get some help in understanding how to deal in a more healthy way when you find yourself in a grieving situation. So with this, I'd like to welcome you, Karen. I'd like to talk about what you conceive of when you say the word grief and why what was isn't anymore works for you in ways that introduce the idea that grief is more than just being sad about somebody who's passed away.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chuck, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So if you look up grief in Google definition, you will typically find something that says a significant sorrow over, or a deep emotional sorrow over significant loss. And Chuck, as you mentioned, it is, I've added on to when what once was is no longer. So think of it as a metaphorical book that we have, where we have seasons or chapters of our life, where it could be when that person's in our life, when we had that job, when we had that relationship, when we had that set of finances, that health. And then there is something that happens where what we had is no longer. And one good example here is COVID grief. There is actually something called COVID grief. When we had that experience where we could visit people without restrictions, that we can travel, that we can have these conversations. And then there was a loss of normalcy. There was a loss of safety, of security, of the norms that we had. And in some cases, loss of individuals that we loved. And so it was like moving to another chapter in our life when what once was here is no longer. But it's not like proverbial just turn the page in a book and all of a sudden we can fully step into that. There's that transition period. So when what once was is no longer, grief is about how we transition from that one chapter to another.
As you think about the idea of grieving, you do offer some formulaic ideas about how you approach it, but you also share some people's powerful stories about different aspects of grieving and death, because that's obviously one of the things that comes to mind when anybody thinks about grieving. But we're also going to talk about divorce, which happens to almost half the population in our country. A lot of people are wondering about how do I deal with that in a healthy way? And then also look at the idea of being diagnosed with an illness that might be life-threatening and how you look at each one with sort of like a prequel, if you will, a little story about what's happening, and then a debrief that shows people how to use the tools that you're asking people or suggesting that people might want to use to deal with grief in a more healthy way than typically the trial and error, which is how we deal with a lot of emotional upsets in our lives. I happen to have some friends this past year, who have lost adult children. And I don't think there's anything more painful. And that experience isn't supposed to happen. We're supposed to, as parents, pass away first. And yet I have friends, several of them, that have had that experience in their lives, and some very recently. And one of the things that I liked about your book, and maybe you can talk about this, is the idea of an acute experience versus an experience where you actually own it and understand that there are certain things that you never really get over. So maybe we could talk about grief that way just for a little while.
Yes, good, Chuck. And to set some of that up, I'm going to further emphasize some of what you just mentioned. The book is not just on the framework, so the healthy grief framework. It breathes life into it with the 30 grief survivor case studies that are in there, the grief survival case studies. And they are in 7 different categories. And you also just talked about 3 main categories around the death and dying, divorce, as well as when it comes to health, for example. So in there, when it comes to the loss of, for example, a child, one of the hardest griefs to go through is the loss of a child, because it breaks what naturally should happen. Unfortunately, as you said, you do have a number of people who have lost adult children. Coming into this weekend, as we're recording this, I'm actually going to a memorial service for good friends of mine who unfortunately lost their 18-year-old son in a tragic way. So it is a hard thing to go through. And one of the stories that is in there is Donna's story, specifically her grief survival story about the loss of her daughter at the age of 19. And this backs into both the acute as well as the integrated grief that's in here. As I was having conversations with individuals, starting with my own clients first, as well as some others that I knew, some colleagues and things, or was introduced to people who had various different types of grief stories, I interviewed them to make sure that they were healthfully enough through that grief process. What do I mean by that? I wanted to make sure as they were sharing their own stories, I was not re-traumatizing them. And I actually had one gentleman, he was the second person that I interviewed for this book. He had lost his son tragically 11 years prior. And when I had conversations with him, I knew it was still a struggle at this point in time. I had certified him in NLP, so I knew him well. And he committed to me, but he was struggling in writing it. And I finally said, David, this is not the best time. I knew that he was still going through that grief process. So I gracefully invited him not to write his story. I didn't want to re-traumatize it. So when we talk about acute versus integrated grief, acute is when you have that experience, whether it is the loss of a loved one you're initially going through, the end of a relationship, or just found out about a health diagnosis. There's all these different types. So acute is in the beginning stages of that grief, when you start to cycle through various different emotions, where then you can then come to a point where it is then integrated, meaning, or it is that prolonged grief, that diagnosis that's there, where it comes to a point where I've integrated it into my life in such a way that this experience happens, but it is not controlling my life. I don't wake up each morning and heavily grieving over the loss of what once was. If you do, then that is that prolonged grief disorder, which is one of the things that's mentioned in the book. Integrated is, there's some days I may wake up and acknowledge the loss that I have, and I may have an emotion, but it doesn't control my day. Or there may be days that I do wake up and I forget about that loss, or it doesn't come to me. So integrated means that we are healthfully enough along the process where that emotion associated with the loss does not control our life, doesn't put us into a spiral. It doesn't take over our whole day, week, months at a time. And so integrated is when we can acknowledge that we had a loss, but are not taken down by the emotion associated with it.
So for me, I think, and for everyone listening, I think one of the things that comes from what you just said is that it is what you might consider somewhat normal to have days, even when you have a number of good days in a row, to then have a bad day where you might wake up. And this is what I resonated with in understanding the idea of integrated. It's not gone. It's part of what's happened in your life. It's part of your journey, your experience, and it is harsh and hard reality to accept, but it is part of what's happened. And on good days, you're not fine with it ever, but you're fine with moving on with your life, understanding that this has happened, it's tragic, but it's also not happening today. It's happened in the past, and I'm moving forward with the day so that the day can be good with everybody and anybody that I come into contact with, and for myself. But there might be moments in that day or different days that I'm going to experience that. And then I think what's important to me, and kind of a meta-conscious way, is not to be judgmental and critical of myself, for I want to get ahead of this. I want to let go of this. I don't want to think about this anymore, because I think part of this acceptance is that you're always going to think about it at different times. But when you think about it, maybe you remember it and think about the positive memories associated with the person or the situation. Hold on to that as best you can. Take a few deep breaths and move forward. I mean, that's the way I think about it. Maybe something to take away right here. Does that sound right?
Yes. In fact, there's two pieces, Chuck, and I'm glad you brought it up, that actually come out of Donna's story that it is in the book, who lost her daughter. One of the things she mentions, and it does come from a theorist, I'm not quite sure who mentioned it, is it's grief. It's like a ball where grief in and of itself will remain that size. Like she will always have that loss of her daughter. but she grows life where it's bigger around it, where the life around it, the life she creates is bigger than that loss. That's one way in which she describes it. The loss will always be there, but she builds a life around it where the life is bigger than the loss. The other piece is that when somebody is grieving, there is a difference between saying moving forward versus moving on. Now, recognize it depends upon various different types of grief. So if we're talking about a divorce, for example, this may not show up with that. But when somebody actually has they've lost a significant loved one, to say to them, move on, could be triggering, because what it means is I'm moving on and leaving that person behind that's so important to me, versus saying, how can I, as a griever, move forward in my life? That's a different way. The words are very different. Moving on from that loss or moving forward almost with the loss. So two different things that I wanted to mention there.
So important to think about that. Semantics and words and language matter. And it's really more important about what you feel around these things, so that you can accept the fact that you are moving forward with your life, and that this still was a part of your life, is a part of your life in terms of your memories of this person in that situation and what's happened. And again, to me, sometimes if I find people are triggered by certain things, and this obviously can be a trigger when something pops in that reminds you of the loss of a child, adult or younger, that all of a sudden when you're triggered, I like to have people in the work that I do with them to be mentally prepared to have a response, a narrative in their head that comes up. That's pretty much something that they've worked on. It's not going to be right the first time you use it, but it's going to be over time something that really, really works for you in terms of helping you, if you, as you said, move forward. Not to ignore, not to deny, it's real, it happened, but allows you to just remember, again, something positive associated with the person, something that makes you even want to smile despite the sadness that's associated with it. I'd like to ask you, Karen, to talk about the idea of there's several models that help people to cope with the kind of things we're just talking about now. And we'll come back and talk about a few other cases. But let's talk a little bit about how you conceived of the idea of creating models, and then a little bit, if you want, to tell us how those models work and how they might relate to something like a loss of a child.
Yes. Well, I'm going to start first with the healthy grief framework and how that came about. So as I was writing this book, I started with the stories. Honestly, I started with my own stories of various different types of grief to get that out. And then I realized I do not want to write a book about me. That was just not where I wanted to go. And I sat back and I said, what is it within these stories that's powerful? What is it within these stories that I really want readers to take away? And that's where it came to grief. That's where that term really focusing on around understanding what grief is and how can I healthfully process through this grief. Hence the title, Healthy Grief. So I remember walking into, we have these moments where things just come to us. I was stepping into the shower and I remember thinking, I want something that is quick and easy, something that is like 5 letters, maybe 7. Chuck, you and I talked about the number 7 earlier. So we know it's something easy. It's something that people can remember. And by the way, you also mentioned earlier about Kubler-Ross. So this kind of gets into that conversation as well. And when I was in my shower, all of a sudden it came to me and I said, grief, Grief, grief. It's 5 letters. It's easy to remember. And as I sat down and I started to outline all the pieces of what I used in my personal life as well as what I used with clients, it just flowed. So that's how the framework came about. And loosely, the healthy grief framework, grief being the acronym, is basically looking at how do we tie in what we're thinking as well as the logistical information associated with that grief. How do we tie in the emotions associated or relate? So it's gathering information relating to emotions. What then do we then take action on or take action from our thoughts and our feelings? So we're not just getting stuck in the grief itself, even if it's incremental steps that we take, especially when I was working with clients during COVID. It may be something like getting out of bed before noon, putting on clothes that day versus being in your PJs the whole day, or going out for a walk once a week. So it could be incremental, but I is involved. So taking actions. E is ease, which means as part of easing what I'm going through, what support do I need? Formal or informal support to be able to process through what I'm going through. And F is focus, which is around what does that next chapter look like for me? What does it look like now that I am no longer in a relationship? I no longer have that person, or I'm in a different health situation. What does that next chapter or that future vision look like? And again, it could be something where when we're in the middle of the acute stages, we're in the beginning of that grief, we may not know. So it may be, what does today, the end of today look like? What does the end of the week look like? What does the end of the month look like for me? So incrementally, we're starting to get our vision wider and wider on that. So the GRIEF relates to our thoughts, emotions, taking action, support, as well as that future vision. And that's where that framework came about, Chuck.
In the emotion roadmap, it starts with, tell me about your situation, which is, at least to me, relates to gather the facts.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then, so that's the first part. And then how are you feeling about this? And is the feeling helpful? And so, yours is relating to the emotions. I think that we talk about emotions in the next step in the roadmap. And then we look at, well, if the emotions aren't helpful, we look at what would be ideal to feel, which is based on a vision of the future of what you want to feel. So the focus and vision at least ties into there. And then we look at strategies, which is the involvement in what can we do? What are some of the things? And also ease, I think, what kind of support do we need? I mean, all that can show up under understanding how do we change from what we are feeling to what we want to feel. And then finally, the managing for me is, okay, so what are we actually willing and able to do? And if we have a strategy that we're willing and actually able to do, that's a go and do strategy. Go do it. Right?
Yes.
So I think there's elements that relate to each other in the models.
Definitely.
And, so that kind of pulls it together, hopefully for our listeners as well, for people that listen to the show and understand the emotion roadmap. But I think when you tie it specifically the way you have, and again, I encourage people to buy the book, because I think as I was reading the book, I mean, everybody can hold on to even the emotion roadmap, the questions, but when you actually hear a conversation when a caller might call me and you see how it's used, or you read your book and you understand how that model, by debriefing that person's story, Donna's story about her daughter had some mental health issues. You know, you always think as a parent, I should have done more. I could have done more. I'm guilty as charged, in my own head for not doing enough somehow. Whether it was how I raised her or what I could have done that day. I mean, there's so many things that you have to learn to somehow live with yourself. And as you point out earlier, to move forward. So, you also have the Sarah model. And that's kind of like the reaction to when this happens, right? There's a part of that says, oh my God, and you're in shock. And you want to talk about that some?
Yes. So when I boil it down to the emotion part of the healthy grief framework, which is the second stage, which is relate. So relating to the emotions, what I wanted to provide people was a framework to be able to understand where they are on the emotional chart. So let me step back a bit. When I'm working with people who are in grief, a number of things they mention is I'm stuck. I am stuck. I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm at. Just I'm stuck. That's a key word. So when looking at these frameworks, I think of it like a metaphorical map. Again, we come in a lot of images. We've already talked about the book image, but think about a treasure map where you have certain paths. Like Chuck, you mentioned the road map. That's a path, right? It's like a map. So people know how to maneuver, to negotiate, to navigate, and navigate is part of the subtitle to this book as well. So navigating and normalizing loss. That's part of the subtitle. So it's by providing that framework, they then can say, like, if you were in a mall and you're trying to figure out where you are, you go to the big kiosk and it shows with an X, here's where you are on that map. So that's where the healthy grief framework, that's where the Sarah model comes in. Now, the Sarah model is actually not my own. It is something that is commonly used in the corporate world. I actually had trouble trying to track down exactly where it came from, but it is commonly used. So I've been in the field of leadership development and coaching for over 30 years. So that was a model where it was simple, it was easy. Many people can understand it. So I've used it with C-suite executives. I've used it with teenagers and everywhere in between. And usually when I set it up, everything I'm presenting, that's one thing that people have come back and say, thank you, because it's simple, it's easy, it's memorable, and it helps them. So that's why I integrated it into the book so people can easily understand the emotions. Now, let me step back before I talk more about the Sarah model, because one of the things you and I, Chuck, you and I talked about just before we launched into this was about who is more well known when it comes to grief and the 5 stages, which is Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Now, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross created the 5 stages of grief, her model, and it was originally based upon individuals who had terminal illnesses. So think about the grief experience that somebody may go through when they've just been diagnosed with something that they know is life-threatening. It is terminal. There is an end that is coming, and the various different emotions that they may go through when they know that there is an end to their chapter, their book of life. So it was originally created out of that study. However, it has over the decades has been used for various different types of grief that it was not intended to be used for. Okay, so recognize healthy grief. I am taking it in different directions. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model was specifically around those who, again, were diagnosed with life-threatening diseases at an end. So the Sarah model is looking at some of the emotions that we might experience as we are going through a grief. When you think about you've just been informed around something that is eliciting a grief experience, which could be maybe you just found out that you just lost a grandmother or something. So let's just stick with the death and dying for a moment. When you hear of that first call, first news, somebody just told you, text message, whatever it is, starting with S, so SARAH is the first emotion that you might experience, or really I pause here in saying emotion because it's the first experience, may be shock, like numb. When I was even talking with some of our grief survivals, I didn't have a feeling. I was just numb. I was feeling shocked. Now, some associate S with sadness. Whatever it means for you, that's perfectly fine. Maybe I'm sad because I just lost grandma. So S can mean various different things. In the traditional Sarah model, it's that shock that happens. Then it may then filter into anger. And again, I say may because it depends upon the different type of grief, different types of loss, as well as what are those experiences that we're having, our past traumas, our past triggers, our past limiting beliefs that are playing into this Sarah model. So traditionally it may be shock. Then we're coming into anger. And again, there's various different words that could be associated with that. And then right down at the bottom, we're thinking about the dip of emotions that's down there. R traditionally stands for resistance. We may be resisting, which could be I'm bargaining my way out of, like, no, that person, grandma has to be here. She has to make that pie for my birthday, or, all those senses there. Or I'm really even rage. It could be R, like it's this deep anger. Or one of them, when I used this in a recent presentation, somebody said rock bottom. So it's whatever R may represent. And when I actually present the model in healthy grief, I actually tie in the multiple different words that are around those. So even if we think about sadness, anger, and rock bottom, for example, instead of shock, anger, and resistance, it doesn't really matter. It's just a model to understand the various different emotions that people may have. Then as we start to come out of the Sarah model, that second A is acceptance. So I'm accepting now that grandma has passed. I may not like it. I may not fully go through. I'm acknowledging that I'm still going through the grief process, but I can at least acknowledge that grandma's not going to be here for my birthday or the holiday to make that favorite pie, for example. And then the last is H, which can be the hope or the healing part of the Sarah model, that we're coming to the point where, again, we're moving past just accepting it and moving into now it is part of my life. I don't think about it all the time. It doesn't control my life anymore. So though that's part of the Sarah model, and again, in healthy grief, I talk about the various different emotions that are around there, but typically it's shock, anger, resistance, acceptance, and hope or healing.
So in your book, you have the model that you lay out has a lot of, as you just shared, a lot of different words that could be. And I noticed that there's like you filled in like every blank space with a different feeling as you looked at this U-shaped curve, which starts again with the shock and then the anger associated with it, and then the resistance, which takes multiple forms, and then moves into hopefully accepting at some point, and then the healing or hope that you suggested. So again, I encourage everybody to think about, you're hearing about this idea of a model that says what you experience as you look at or find out about somebody or something that's happened in your life that is something that causes you to feel like what was isn't anymore, and it's not a good thing in your mind. A friend of mine used to say that the only one that he ever met that enjoyed change was a baby with a wet diaper. He didn't really.
Yes.
There weren't too many people that wanted to change that they didn't initiate. I should say that. But some people look to change, and it's their own change, and they're getting a new home, and they're excited about. So there are changes that, or they're getting married, and that's an exciting change, or they're getting divorced, and that's an exciting change. So, but I think most of the time that's when you want to initiate something. So when change happens to you, things that you didn't ask for and you don't welcome and you're upset about, then what do you do with it? And I think that hopefully everybody's getting the sense that there's a lot to learn from what you've written, Karen, what your experiences are through through both the Sarah framework and the grief framework. Now, I want to be smart about the time, so I will share just Kubler-Ross model was really great for, in the number of years for a long time, organizations were going through downsizing. And then a lot of people experience losses during those times. Loss of the people sitting beside you or yourself losing your own job. And then what do you do about that? How do you process the emotions? Obviously, you got to go out and decide that you want to find new work, but do you lose your self-confidence? Do you get angry and just mad and vengeful towards the people that did this to you? Is there something that maybe you worry that you did to yourself? And you go through all kinds of mental anguish as you try to struggle with how do you move forward and again, move forward to kind of use the words that you said. And there was this idea of, denial sometimes that it's really happening, and then the actual shock that it did, and then the anger associated with it. And then at some point, when the model works in the way it's supposed to, and there's a healthy grieving, if you will, or healthy experience of this, you start to do the idea of accepting that life has changed. You need to consider what the possibilities are. And you go on, and one of the ways I like to present it is, you're on to a new adventure. You've written, that chapter is closed, and you're about to start a new chapter, and you're the one writing it. What do you want to say happens here? And so you start to not only explore new opportunities, but you get excited about it until finally you find something, hopefully, that makes you feel like I'm committed. This doesn't really look that bad. This could even be good, maybe. And hopefully then you embrace that. So this model's been out there for a while, but the way you've tied it in, I think, in your book, and again, hopefully encourages people when they read your book to use these tools as they experience them. And maybe I'd like you to talk a little bit about one of the things that showed up that I thought was really interesting was this idea of toxic positivity. And so I'd really like to capture the idea of what do you say to try to help somebody else out? Again, I was going through 2 different experiences with my friends that lost their adult children this year. One knew that their daughter was dying for cancer over months. They kept going down to see her. They kept trying to find other specialists to work with her. They did everything they could. And then finally, she just died. Another person, the young woman was not a healthy person, but there was nothing imminent. There was some things she was dealing with, but she just didn't wake up one morning. Actually, I think she went to the hospital. They didn't find anything wrong. She came home and died that night. Mm. So lots of reasons to be very angry with the hospital, with life, God, whatever you might believe in. And, but a very different experience because the one had this whole almost a year-long venture to try to help find a cure, and the others just happened. Either way, now you got to live with this, and you got to deal with it. And as somebody who is a friend to that group, I'd like you to talk some about what toxic positivity does, because that's uniquely common, I think, and well-intended, but often unhelpful. But also, what are some things as a friend, as a caring person, as a relative maybe, that you might say or do that would be comforting?
Good. Thank you, Chuck. So the full title to the book is Healthy Grief, Normalizing and Navigating Loss in a Culture of Toxic Positivity. And I put that in there specifically because it gets into thinking about ways in which us, either as a supporter, Chuck, like you're talking about, as a supporter or as a griever, that we do things to hinder the healthy grief process. That as a griever, we are hindering our process because we want to put on that happy, smiley face or feel happy. Or as a supporter, we either are feeling uncomfortable with somebody else's grief or we feel like we have to jump up, which then discounts the emotional process they're going through and hinders somebody's grief process. So the book itself is both for a griever as well as a supporter. So know that throughout the process, it's actually speaking to both people. So let's come to your question around toxic positivity. First of all, we live in a society and in many cases a world that is grief avoidance. We want to be positive. And here within the United States, we actually wrote that into the Declaration of Independence, is the pursuit of happiness. We want to be happy and positive. And there's a lot of books out there, by the way, about how to acquire, how to win, how to gain, whether it's YouTube videos, books, seminars, etc. But there's less information that is out there that is around how to lose, let go, and grieve. Hence this book, Healthy Grief. So what then is toxic positivity? It is something where whether it is we as a griever are doing something, feeling something to minimize or tap down the emotions we're really feeling. So for example, it may be one of those things that as a griever, I don't want to make other people feel sad. So I'm going to put on the smiley face, or I have to put on the smiley face for everybody else because I don't want them to ask me about what's going on, because if they do, I may break down crying. Or I am going into a holiday dinner and I feel like I have to put on that smiley face because I want to make sure everybody else is cheerful, right? Or as a supporter, we want to do the best we can by cheering that person up if they're the friend, or saying something that we think might help them. Again, if there's, and I talk more about it in the book, when we're saying certain things, we also may be downplaying their own emotions. And here's an example. One of the individuals I already mentioned, his name's David, who when I interviewed him for the book, he's the one whose son unfortunately passed away 11 years prior to me having the conversation with him. And his son passed away, had taken his life at that point in time. So he was still grieving. And he said one of the things that somebody said to him with all good intentions, but looked at him and said, well, your son is in a better place. To which he responded something along the lines of F you, like, hey, you may say that. And I'm sure that person said it because they wanted to say something positive to him. But as a griever, it's like, no, the better place for him to be is here with me. How dare you say that about my son? So we never know what's going to happen with a griever who's going through the process without we can discount their feelings and emotions. So in healthy grief, I talk about toxic positivity. What is it? As well as both as a griever and a supporter, what you can do and say to be able to be helpful in that grieving process. For example, Chuck, if you're going through some grieving process, then I could say something as simple as, I'm so sorry you're going through that. Just acknowledging. Because one thing that a griever wants to do is to be seen, heard, and understood. Seen, heard, and understood. So if you're grieving, just saying, I acknowledge, I see you. I see you. Even if it is, I feel you. Sometimes I even say, I feel you. Now I caution, I understand you could be a trigger. Because the way in which you are feeling a grief and I understand it could be seen as different. No, you can't understand what I'm going through because you've never been through what I'm going through. So I do caution around using the term, I understand you. Okay. I feel you. I see you. I care for you. What can I do for you? Like acknowledging that other person in their grief. Is without going into all the details that I have in the book, that is like the best entree to it. Another piece that I actually picked up from a friend of mine who wrote her own book around grief, and I've used this with some individuals. So I've also, depending upon the type of rapport you have with somebody, and again, if you have somebody who has had a loss, for example, a death of a loved one, is tell me about them. Like, what's your favorite memory about that person? Now, again, that is building rapport with somebody. What that does is you want to make sure it's not jumping into like, tell me some positive person, which then prevents that person from experiencing that emotion and gets into the toxic positivity. Okay, so we want to make sure it's not the first thing you lead with. But if it is like they've gone through it, they've shared like, yes, this is what's going on. Tell me about that person. Like, what's your favorite memory of grandma? And if they're open to it and engaging, that may be one way where they can start to share their process of grief, even if it is a positive memory about grandma making favorite pies for your birthday. And in other words, it's setting the stage to allow them to share and giving them a prompt around sharing if and when they choose to do so.
It's really interesting. And one of the things I try to teach with the roadmap, Karen, is that the response that you might have for one person may not be the same response you really want to use with another person. So while I think that the idea of you might be in a better place for somebody that's 95 years old and passed away and had a good life and this was expected and they were in pain and they've moved on and it's so different than, so you've lost your child that you wanted to, to be with you until your last remaining breaths, and, so you have to really be thoughtful, I guess, about who it is you're talking to. How do you say something that's going to be seen in a positive light? Not positive in the sense that you want them to feel like up and happy about what's happened, but that you're seen as supportive and caring, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And very good point. Again, whatever we do say to somebody is put it in the context of what kind of rapport I have, what's the situation, how is the other person might feel and respond to it, which again plays into emotional intelligence. So, for example, at the time of this writing, and I share this story in Healthy Grief as well, I lost my mother and my brother 2 weeks apart. That was 2 years ago. So when it comes up in conversation, And I was helpfully enough along the process, right? Because I used myself as a case study. Even there during that period of time, I was doing Facebook Lives to share with people as I was, okay, these are things that I techniques I use with my clients. How is it working with me? When I talk about that situation, and again, I'm healthier along, usually the first response is, oh, I'm sorry, you lost your mother. So what I do is I actually have a phrase to help people know where I am on that stage. So that stage of that grief model. So I typically say, yeah, so in January of 2022, I happened to lose my brother and my mother 2 weeks apart. My mother at the young age of 97 and a half passed away, and she was so ready to go. Now, can you hear the tone of my voice? And those who are seeing us live visually can see it's a whole different demeanor. So I'm inviting somebody, just because of my tone of voice and my facial demeanor, into allowing to ask any questions they want or feel comfortable with the grief that I'm going through versus, oh yeah, I lost my mom, she died. And it's a different kind of tone of energy. So even as a griever, we can actually help somebody else understand or support us along that grieving process, depending upon how we show up for them.
Hopefully people have gotten from the conversation to date, there's a lot that has to do with how we approach and what we say, how we show up, and there's a framework for being much more healthy in how you deal with the grief response as opposed to whatever trial and error methods you might be using currently, that sometimes work, sometimes don't. I think it really benefits everybody that you've written the book, and hopefully a lot of people will buy it and share it, and people will get tools for themselves to deal more effectively with grief. But I wanted to give you a chance to talk about those other models in about 5 minutes, if you could, about how it shows up in other situations besides just the death of someone.
Yes, thank you. So disenfranchised grief is another form of grief, which basically, Chuck, we've talked about. Is it something that is beyond just death and dying, where it is not necessarily seen as a grief? For example, there is COVID grief that we've just talked about, but many of us experienced it, so we understood that it was a grief. But for example, there may be a loss of something that somebody is going through the emotional grief process that other people are like, why are you sad about that? So that's why in the Healthy Grief book, I have 7 different categories of different types of grief. So yes, it does start off with the traditional death and dying. It then goes into intimate relationships such as divorce and breakups. It has other relationships such as family estrangements, and it goes into things like health that we just talked about. So health challenges, as well as maternity. So I have some stories in there associated with women who stillbirth or in a situation was forced to make a decision and terminate her pregnancy midway through. So maternity stories that are in there, as well as identity. Many of them are related to career identity. And then the last section in there is called trilogy. The idea that there is, not the idea, but many stories that have had distinct grief, one right after the other. Compound grief. Many of those stories also have body-related or health-related griefs that are in there. So healthy grief also focuses on the fact that understanding grief and help you resolve grief so it doesn't settle in the body. So I want to emphasize this is unresolved grief will settle in the body. So with each of those 30 grief stories, if there's any mention about any major or minor or life-threatening illnesses, aches or pains or illnesses, in my review, each of the 30 stories is a case study because I place upon them the healthy grief framework so readers like you can understand how that framework shows up in those stories. So how did they think? How did they feel? What action steps did they take? What support did they seek? Did the future look like for them? So even if the framework itself is so open, you can at least, when you take the book and you read it, is you then can relate to the various different stories that are in there, whether it's the person, the story itself, or maybe the various different ways that they then worked through their own grief. That's the intention behind the 30 different stories that are in there. And when it comes to the body, if there is, again, any mention about any minor or major aches or pains or major illnesses, I also led with some questions that I use with my own clients to help identify what could be some past traumas, triggers, or limiting beliefs that are underneath that physical manifestation. And there's some powerful stories that are in there, one of which is Stephanie's, who was one of my clients who came to me first because she was stage 2 cancer diagnosis. And what was underneath that was back to her husband who committed suicide 5 years before, and she was carrying the guilt that was underneath that. And it also, in doing the work, went back to when she was sexually molested by a family member when she was 6 years old. So trauma will develop, unresolved trauma, unresolved grief will develop in the body. And part of healthy grief is to truly be healthy in a way that we can release that grief, that emotional hold, so it doesn't settle in the body.
Well, I think you had some, no guarantees, but I think you've had some help, some work and with Stephanie that she actually got healthy.
Yes.
And I don't know that you can point and say it was because she used Sarah and she used grief and she talked to you, but there seems to be a connection. And I think you had was it Woody Allen? I think I don't get angry, or I don't get sad. I grow a tumor. I think something like that.
Yes.
But I think the idea is, and why it's funny is because all of us have thought that the stress we experience, the different kinds of emotional upheaval, sometimes, as you point out, settles in the body and causes either an illness or some kind of cancerous tumor of some kind. But the connections aren't really clear, but they seem to be there.
Yes. And I have, having worked with over 1,200 individuals just within the last 4 years, there are very different stories that I could tell of specific clients who, once releasing the energy that's underneath that, immediately, in some cases, have the physical release of that ailment. And even one case that came up here a month ago.
Well, and also I think one of the other things I'll tell you in your book that I thought was interesting was the cultural norms and the impact that they have. By the way, I think, again, there's so much to talk about, but I do want to point out to people that sometimes what you believe to be true about where you grew up and what you learned and what your parents taught you and what you want to then do for somebody that might be grieving may or may not be helpful, because their parents and their experiences and where they grew up might be extremely different. And that you don't really know what people's cultural norms are and how they deal with different kinds of situations, grief being one of them. Maybe you should try and find out, if you can, if somebody comes from a very different place than you, before you just try to be supportive, even though your intentions are only the best for the other person. But again, I encourage people to take a look at your book and to learn from it and to just spend some time thinking about all these things, because I know that culturally for me, you want to man up, right? That's what you hear as a kid growing up, as a boy. You want to man up. You want to be a grown up. You want to hold on to those emotions. You don't want to experience these things. You want to be tough. You want to be strong for your kids. You don't want to show weakness. You don't want to show sadness. And yet I think it was Brene Brown. I think maybe, some of the things that she said about how important it is to show vulnerability in life as a role model, but also for yourself to be able to allow yourself to, not have to be a statue.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's, again, a lot of things I thought were really beneficial in your book. I appreciate you spending the time with us today and sharing about it. One other thing I want to mention is really important. For all the things that you might experience, Karen has listed in her book multiple resources. So, and if you find that you're in a certain category of things, and just check out the chapter on resources. So that's an important consideration too. But also, how do people buy your book? How do they find it?
How they find it, they can go ahead and go to my website, which is drkarenkramer.com, drkarenkramer.com, and it will have a link directly to Healthy Grief. That's the easiest way to find it right now.
And Karen is Karen, and Kramer is Kramer, right?
Correct.
Okay. drkarenkramer.com. That's where they go?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you very much, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening to us. And I hope you got some benefit, and that while nobody wants you to be grieving, we all experience grief at different times, and I hope that you've learned some things that are going to help you to take the wheel and control how you feel. Thanks so much for being here, Karen. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chuck. A pleasure.
Okay, thanks.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.